The photograph arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 months after Christmas had passed. My hands trembled as I held the glossy cardstock, studying the perfect arrangement of faces that should have included mine. The Hendersons stood in their living room, bathed in the warm glow of twinkling lights, their smiles practiced and serene. Mother wore her burgundy dress, the one she'd insisted I help her choose. Father's hand rested on her shoulder with paternal authority. My sister Emma stood between them, radiant in ivory silk, her engagement ring catching the photographer's flash. I searched every corner of the image, every shadow, every reflected surface in the background mirrors. Nothing. No trace of me anywhere, as if I had never existed at all. But I remembered that day. I remembered standing right there, in that exact spot, wearing the navy blazer Mother had picked out for me. I remembered the photographer's instructions, the multiple takes, the way the lights made my eyes water. I remembered everything. The return address bore our family name, but I had never seen the handwriting before. The morning of the photo shoot had begun like any other December day, with frost painting intricate patterns across my bedroom window and the scent of cinnamon rolls drifting up from the kitchen. I had dressed carefully in the outfit Mother had selected, the navy blazer with brass buttons, the crisp white shirt, the burgundy tie that matched her dress. Everything had been planned weeks in advance, down to the smallest details. Emma had arrived early with her fiancé David, both of them glowing with that particular radiance of the newly engaged. The diamond on her finger seemed to catch every available beam of light, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls as she gestured. Mother fussed over her hair, adjusting invisible imperfections while Father paced near the mantelpiece, periodically checking his watch. The photographer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an air of professional detachment, had arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. He moved through our living room like a choreographer, repositioning furniture and adjusting the lighting equipment he'd brought in several black cases. The tripod legs extended with metallic clicks that echoed in the suddenly formal atmosphere of our home. I had taken my place beside Emma as we had discussed. The arrangement felt natural, parents in the back, children in front, a classic family portrait configuration that would look perfect on the Christmas cards Mother had already ordered. 500 cards with gold foil lettering that read, "Season's greetings from the Henderson family." But when the photographer looked through his lens and began making adjustments, something shifted in the room's energy. He frowned, stepped back, consulted the light meter hanging around his neck. Mother moved closer to Father. Emma adjusted her posture, and I remained exactly where I was, smiling as instructed. The photographer's next words would replay in my mind for months afterward, though at the time they seemed merely part of the professional process. "This isn't quite right," he had said, lowering his camera. "The composition feels unbalanced." Mother approached me with careful steps, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that seemed almost apologetic. Her expression held that particular combination of firmness and regret that I had learned to recognize from childhood, the look that preceded explanations I wouldn't like but was expected to accept without argument. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice carrying the tone she used when delivering news she believed was for the greater good. "We need you to step aside for a moment." The words didn't immediately register as rejection. I assumed she meant step aside temporarily, perhaps so the photographer could adjust the lighting or reposition someone else. I moved toward the kitchen doorway, expecting to be called back within minutes. But the photographer resumed his work without me. Through the doorway, I watched him direct my family into new positions, filling the space where I had stood with a subtle shift of bodies and angles. Emma moved slightly to the left. Father's hand settled more naturally on Mother's shoulder. The composition that had felt unbalanced with my presence now seemed to achieve the harmony the photographer had been seeking. I waited in the kitchen, listening to the rapid succession of camera clicks, the photographer's occasional directions, the rustle of clothing as positions were adjusted. The scent of the cinnamon rolls I had helped Mother prepare that morning seemed to grow stronger, almost overwhelmingly sweet, as if my heightened awareness was amplifying every sensory detail of this moment of exclusion. When the sounds from the living room finally ceased, I expected to be called back for additional shots, perhaps individual portraits or different groupings that would include me. Instead, I heard the photographer packing his equipment, the metallic sounds of tripod legs collapsing and lens caps being replaced. Mother found me standing at the kitchen counter, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had grown cold while I waited. "The session went beautifully," she said, her smile bright but somehow not reaching her eyes. "I think we got exactly what we needed." The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't yet ready to examine. The conversation I had been avoiding finally occurred 3 days later, when the photographer's initial proofs arrived via email. Mother called me into the study where she sat at Father's mahogany desk, the computer screen displaying a grid of thumbnail images. Each small photograph showed the same scene, my family arranged in perfect harmony, their faces glowing with warmth and contentment. I studied each image carefully, searching for some mistake, some oversight that would explain my absence. Perhaps there were additional photos, taken after I had stepped away, that included me. But as Mother scrolled through the entire collection, the truth became undeniable. I existed in none of them. "I don't understand," I said finally, my voice sounding strange in the wood-paneled room. "Why aren't there any pictures with me?" Mother's fingers paused over the keyboard. She had been expecting this question, I realized, had probably been preparing her response since the moment she excluded me from the shoot. When she turned to face me, her expression held that same careful combination of firmness and regret. "The photographer made a valid point about the composition," she began, her words measured and deliberate. "With 5 people, the arrangement felt crowded, uneven. The spacing wasn't quite right for the format we needed." Her explanation felt rehearsed, as if she had practiced it in front of the mirror. I waited for her to continue, to offer some alternative solution or compromise. "For the Christmas card," she continued, "we needed something that would reproduce well in print, something that would look clean and professional when reduced to card size. The photographer recommended we keep it to the 4 of us this year." The phrase, "the 4 of us," struck me with unexpected force. In that moment, I understood that this decision had been deliberate, calculated, and final. This wasn't about composition or technical considerations. This was about image, about the carefully curated presentation my family wanted to project to their friends, colleagues, and extended relatives. "It's not the right image for the Christmas card," Mother added, as if this final statement would somehow make the exclusion more palatable. I wanted to argue, to point out the absurdity of excluding one member of the family from the family portrait. But something in Mother's tone, in the set of her shoulders, told me that this discussion was already over. The decision had been made, the photographs had been taken, and the cards would be printed exactly as planned. In the days that followed, I found myself studying my family with new attention, searching for clues about how this decision had been reached. Had they discussed it beforehand? Had there been a family meeting I wasn't invited to? The logistics of the exclusion suggested planning, coordination, a level of forethought that made the rejection feel more calculated than spontaneous. Father seemed unchanged, reading his newspaper at breakfast with the same methodical attention to detail he had always displayed. But occasionally I caught him glancing at me over the sports section, his expression unreadable behind his reading glasses. These moments felt loaded with significance, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the appropriate words. Emma threw herself into wedding planning with renewed intensity, her conversations dominated by discussions of venues and flowers and dress fittings. When she spoke about the Christmas cards, it was always in terms of how beautiful they would be, how pleased everyone would be to receive them. She never mentioned my absence from the photographs, never acknowledged that anything unusual had occurred. Only Mother seemed affected by the decision, her usual efficiency replaced by a subtle restlessness that manifested in small ways. She rearranged the living room furniture twice in 1 week. She started and abandoned several household projects. She spent longer than usual on her evening phone calls with her sister, their conversations taking place behind the closed door of the master bedroom. I began to wonder if excluding me had been her idea or if she had simply gone along with someone else's suggestion. The uncertainty gnawed at me, creating a distance between us that hadn't existed before the photo shoot. Unable to let the matter rest, I decided to conduct my own investigation into the decision-making process. I started with the photographer's business card, which Mother had left on the kitchen counter along with other paperwork from the session. A simple internet search revealed his portfolio, dozens of family portraits, all professionally composed and lit, all featuring complete families arranged in harmonious groupings. I studied these images carefully, looking for patterns that might explain my exclusion. Most of the families consisted of 4 people, but several included 5 or even 6 members without appearing crowded or unbalanced. Children, grandparents, and extended family members were integrated seamlessly into compositions that looked both natural and polished. The evidence contradicted Mother's explanation about the technical difficulties of photographing 5 people. This photographer had clearly managed larger groups successfully on multiple occasions. Next, I examined our own family photographs from previous years, Christmas cards and formal portraits that decorated the hallways and side tables throughout our house. In every single image, I appeared alongside my parents and sister. 5 people had never been a problem before. Something had changed this year, but I couldn't identify what that something might be. I considered calling the photographer directly to ask about his recommendation, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the fear that his answer would confirm my growing suspicion that the exclusion had been requested rather than suggested. The finished cards arrived 2 weeks before Christmas, delivered in a large cardboard box that Mother carried immediately to her bedroom. I didn't see the actual cards until she began addressing envelopes at the kitchen table, each one carefully handwritten in her precise script. The final product was even more perfect than the proofs had suggested. The colors were rich and vibrant, the gold foil lettering elegant against the deep green background. My family looked radiant, prosperous, and complete. No one examining the card would have any reason to suspect that someone was missing from the portrait. Mother worked through her address book systematically, filling out envelopes for relatives, friends, neighbors, and colleagues. The list seemed longer than usual, as if she was determined to share this particular image as widely as possible. She hummed softly while she worked, apparently satisfied with the final result. I found myself studying the card from different angles, holding it at arm's length, examining it under various lighting conditions. Each viewing confirmed the same reality. My family existed perfectly without me. The composition was indeed balanced and harmonious. Whatever had been gained by my exclusion was clearly visible in the finished product. But what had been lost was equally clear, at least to me. The Christmas cards were mailed on a Friday morning in early December, and responses began arriving almost immediately. The kitchen counter accumulated a growing pile of return cards, thank you notes, and holiday greetings from the recipients. Mother read each one aloud during breakfast, her voice bright with satisfaction at the positive reactions. "Beautiful family portrait," wrote Aunt Margaret from California. "You all look wonderful," said the neighbors from across the street. "Such a lovely card," commented Mother's college roommate. Each compliment felt like a small confirmation of the decision to exclude me. The recipients saw exactly what my family had wanted them to see, a perfect unit, harmoniously arranged and professionally presented. No one asked about my absence because no one knew to look for me in the first place. The success of the Christmas card seemed to energize my family in unexpected ways. They began planning their New Year's Eve party with unusual enthusiasm, discussing guest lists and menu options with the same attention to detail that had characterized the photo shoot. I found myself wondering if I would be included in these plans or if my exclusion had established a new pattern. 3 weeks after Christmas, while helping Mother organize the holiday decorations for storage, I made a discovery that changed my understanding of everything that had happened. Hidden behind the artificial Christmas tree in the basement storage room, I found a manila envelope containing what appeared to be additional photographs from our family session. The envelope wasn't labeled, and its location suggested it had been placed there deliberately, out of casual view. Inside were several proof sheets showing the same poses and arrangements I remembered from Mother's computer, but these versions included me. In every single photograph, I stood exactly where I remembered standing, wearing the navy blazer and burgundy tie, smiling as instructed. The technical quality of these images was identical to the versions that had been selected for the Christmas card. The lighting was perfect, the composition was balanced, and my presence didn't create any of the crowding or spacing issues Mother had described. If anything, these photographs looked more natural and complete than the ones that had been chosen. At the bottom of the envelope was a handwritten note in the photographer's script, "Complete family portraits as requested. Alternative versions without youngest son attached per specific client instructions." The phrase "specific client instructions" hit me like a physical blow. Someone in my family had explicitly requested photographs that excluded me. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision made during the shoot or a professional recommendation about composition. This had been planned in advance. I confronted Mother that evening in the kitchen, the envelope of photographs spread across the counter between us. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She didn't deny the evidence or attempt to explain away the note. Instead, she sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs and looked at me with an expression of profound weariness. "I was hoping you wouldn't find those," she said quietly. Her admission opened a floodgate of questions I had been carrying for weeks. Who had made the decision? When had it been made? Why had they felt the need to exclude me from what was supposed to be a family portrait? Mother's answers came slowly, reluctantly, like confessions extracted under pressure. The decision had been discussed among the three of them, herself, Father, and Emma. during one of their planning sessions for the photo shoot. Emma had raised concerns about how the Christmas card would be received by David's family, who were apparently quite conservative and traditional in their views. She was worried about making the right impression, Mother explained, her voice barely above a whisper. David's parents are very particular about family image. Emma thought it would be better if we presented ourselves in a certain way. The implication was clear, though Mother couldn't bring herself to state it directly. My appearance, my mannerisms, something about me didn't fit the image Emma wanted to project to her future in-laws. I had been edited out of the family portrait like a blemish that might mar an otherwise perfect picture. It wasn't personal, Mother added quickly, though we both knew this statement was meaningless. It was just for this one card, just for this 1 year. But I understood now that it would never be just for 1 year. This exclusion had established a precedent, a new definition of what our family looked like when it wanted to present its best face to the world. Once I recognized the pattern, I began to see it everywhere. Family dinners where I wasn't invited when certain guests were present. Social gatherings where my absence was explained away as scheduling conflicts or other commitments. Photographs taken at family events where I was somehow always positioned just outside the frame or encouraged to be the one behind the camera. The exclusion from the Christmas card hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a broader, more systematic editing of my presence from the family narrative. I was included in the private, domestic moments, but excluded from the public presentations, the carefully curated versions of our family life that were shared with the outside world. Emma's engagement had apparently accelerated this process, creating new pressures to present the right image to an expanded social circle. But the foundations had been there long before David entered the picture. I could trace the pattern back through years of similar moments, small exclusions and subtle editing that I had dismissed at the time as coincidence or oversight. The Christmas card had simply made the pattern visible, impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Emma's wedding took place the following June, a lavish affair at a country club that overlooked the lake. Every detail was perfect, from the flowers to the music to the carefully coordinated attire of the wedding party. I attended as a guest, seated with distant relatives at a table far from the main action. The wedding photographer was the same professional who had taken our Christmas card portraits, and I watched him work with the same meticulous attention to composition and lighting. During the family portraits, I waited for my turn to be included in the formal shots, but that invitation never came. Instead, I watched from a distance as he arranged my parents and Emma and David in various configurations, capturing the joining of two families in perfectly framed compositions. The absence of any Henderson family member other than the bride, her parents, and her new husband created an elegant simplicity that would undoubtedly reproduce beautifully in the wedding album. Later, during the reception, I overheard David's mother commenting on how lovely Emma's family was, how perfectly they all complemented each other. The compliment was clearly intended for Mother's ears, and Mother's pleased response suggested that the strategy had been successful. Emma had achieved exactly what she had hoped to achieve. Her new family connections saw the Henderson family as an ideal match, a perfect complement to their own social standing and values. The careful editing of our public image had served its purpose. Summer passed into fall, and I found myself existing in an increasingly strange liminal space within my own family. I was present for private dinners and casual conversations, included in the daily routines and domestic rhythms that constituted our shared life. But whenever our family life intersected with the outside world, I seemed to vanish from the narrative. Birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, social events, all were carefully orchestrated to minimize my visibility or exclude me entirely. The explanations were always reasonable, always presented as temporary accommodations or scheduling necessities. But the cumulative effect was the systematic erasure of my existence from the public version of the Henderson family story. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind, if the exclusion from the Christmas card had triggered some kind of paranoid delusion that was causing me to misinterpret normal family dynamics. But the evidence was too consistent, the pattern too clear to dismiss as imagination. My family had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that their lives would be improved by my absence from their public presentations. I had become a secret they kept from the world, a complication they managed by pretending it didn't exist. When December arrived again, I knew what to expect. The Christmas card photo shoot was scheduled for the same weekend as the previous year, and the same photographer was hired to capture the family portrait. This time, however, I didn't even bother to dress for the session. Instead, I stayed in my room while the photographer set up his equipment downstairs, listening to the familiar sounds of preparation and positioning. The session proceeded exactly as I had predicted, with Mother, Father, and Emma creating another perfectly balanced composition that would reproduce beautifully on cardstock. But this year, something had changed in my family's behavior toward me. The exclusion was no longer accompanied by explanations or apologies. No one mentioned the photo shoot at all, as if it were taking place in a parallel universe that didn't concern me. The Christmas cards arrived and were distributed with the same systematic efficiency as before. The positive responses accumulated on the kitchen counter, and Mother read them aloud with the same satisfaction. But now there was an undercurrent of routine to the process, as if my exclusion had become so normalized that it no longer required conscious thought. I was disappearing not just from photographs, but from the family's awareness of my existence as someone who might reasonably expect to be included in their public presentations. The photographs from that second Christmas session were never hidden. Mother left them openly displayed on her computer, accessible to anyone who cared to look. When I examined them, I found no versions that included me, no alternative shots that suggested my presence had even been considered. This absence of alternatives was somehow more disturbing than the hidden photographs from the previous year. At least then, my exclusion had been deliberate, requiring specific instructions and conscious choice. Now, it appeared that I had been forgotten entirely, edited out of consideration before the session even began. I searched the house for any current photographs that included me, any recent documentation of my existence as part of the family. The most recent image I could find was from Emma's graduation 2 years earlier, and even that photograph showed me positioned at the edge of the group, partially obscured by shadows. The systematic erasure was more complete than I had realized. My presence in the family's visual history was being retroactively edited, older photographs mysteriously disappearing from frames and albums, replaced by versions that showed my parents and sister as a complete unit of 3. In January, David's parents came to visit for the first time since the wedding. They were exactly as I had imagined them, well-dressed, well-spoken, radiating the kind of understated affluence that came from generations of careful social positioning. Mother and Father prepared for their visit with unusual attention to detail, ensuring that every aspect of our house would create the right impression. I was informed, with careful politeness, that it would be better if I made myself scarce during the visit. Mother suggested I might enjoy a weekend skiing trip with friends, or perhaps I could visit my college roommate in the city. The suggestions were presented as opportunities rather than banishment, but the underlying message was clear. I chose to stay in town but remain out of sight, curious to observe how my family would handle questions about my existence. Surely David's parents would have some awareness that Emma had a sibling. Wedding invitations, family conversations, some reference would have established my existence in their minds. From my bedroom window, I watched them arrive and enter the house with warm greetings and embraces. Over the course of the weekend, I listened to conversations about family history, shared memories, and future plans. Not once did anyone mention me or ask about Emma's sibling. Either David's parents had been carefully prepared to avoid the subject, or my family had managed to present themselves so consistently as a unit of 3 that my existence had never entered the conversation. The success of that weekend visit seemed to establish a new template for how my family would handle social interactions. I began to be excluded not just from photographs and formal events, but from casual gatherings and spontaneous social occasions. Friends of my parents would drop by for dinner, and I would be sent on errands or encouraged to eat in my room. Emma's new social circle, expanded by marriage to include David's friends and colleagues, never encountered me at all. When they came to the house for parties or informal gatherings, I simply didn't exist in that space. My room became a hiding place, a sanctuary where I could avoid the complicated logistics of my own invisibility. But the sustained effort required to maintain this fiction was beginning to show strain in my family's behavior. Mother became nervous before social events, clearly anxious about the possibility of my inadvertent appearance. Father grew distant and uncomfortable, avoiding conversations that might naturally lead to questions about family composition. Emma, now living in her own apartment with David, seemed most comfortable with the arrangement. She could visit our house and interact with our parents without any awkward explanations or uncomfortable moments. Her life had been successfully compartmentalized, with the Henderson family presented exactly as she needed it to be. The breaking point came in March, exactly 1 year after I had received that first Christmas card in the mail. I was returning from a routine trip to the grocery store when I encountered Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor from across the street, in the parking lot. She had known our family for over 15 years, had watched Emma and me grow up, had received our Christmas cards every year without fail. She greeted me warmly, asked about my family, and then made a comment that stopped me cold. "I was so sorry to hear about your family's loss," she said, her expression sincere and sympathetic. "Your mother mentioned it when I saw her at the post office last week." I stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. What loss? What had Mother told her? She said it had been a difficult year, Mrs. Patterson continued, but that they were coping as well as could be expected. "The three of them are such a close family." The three of them. I managed to mumble some generic response and escape to my car, my hands shaking as I tried to fit the key into the ignition. Mrs. Patterson's sympathy could only mean one thing. My family had told people I was dead. The lie was so enormous, so complete, that it took my breath away. They hadn't just excluded me from photographs or social gatherings. They had erased my existence entirely, creating a narrative in which I had never survived to see this year. I drove home in a state of shock, my mind reeling with the implications of what Mrs. Patterson had said. When I arrived at the house, I found Mother in the kitchen, calmly preparing dinner as if nothing unusual had occurred. She looked up when I entered, her expression momentarily confused, as if she had forgotten I existed. "You're home early," she said, her voice carrying a strange note of surprise. I confronted her directly about the conversation with Mrs. Patterson, demanding to know what story she had been telling the neighbors. Mother's reaction was unlike anything I had seen from her before. Instead of denial or explanation, she simply looked at me with a kind of bewildered incomprehension, as if I were asking her to explain something that made no sense. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "Mrs. Patterson said you told her about a family loss," I pressed. "She said you mentioned that the three of you were coping with a difficult year." Mother's face went pale, and she sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and I could see her struggling with something internal, some conflict between competing versions of reality. "Maybe I did say something," she admitted eventually. It's been easier that way. Easier." The word hung between us like an indictment. Mother's confession opened a floodgate of revelations about the extent of the deception my family had constructed around my absence. The story had evolved gradually, she explained, beginning with simple omissions and growing into an elaborate fiction that was now impossible to retract. It had started with the Christmas cards. When people commented on the lovely portrait of the three of them, my family had simply not corrected the impression that they constituted the complete family unit. When questions arose about Emma's sibling, they were deflected or ignored until they stopped being asked. Over time, the fiction had acquired its own momentum. Social acquaintances began to remember the Henderson family as a family of three. Neighbors who had known me as a child somehow adjusted their memories to accommodate my absence. The Christmas card had established a new reality that gradually overwrote the old one. "People see what they expect to see," Mother said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Once they accepted us as a family of three, it became true for them. But maintaining the fiction had required increasingly elaborate measures. When people who had known me well asked about my absence, my family had to provide explanations. At first, these were temporary. I was away at school, traveling, working in another city. But temporary explanations had a way of demanding permanent resolutions. The story of my death had been the logical conclusion of this process, the final solution that would end all questions permanently. As Mother continued her explanation, I began to understand the full scope of what had been done to me. I hadn't just been excluded from photographs or social gatherings. I had been systematically erased from existence, edited out of reality itself through a combination of deliberate deception and collective forgetting. The most disturbing aspect was how easily it had been accomplished. People who had known me for years had somehow adjusted their memories to accommodate my absence. Neighbors, family, friends, even some relatives had accepted the revised version of the Henderson family without question. Mother seemed almost as bewildered by the process as I was. She described it as something that had happened gradually, without conscious planning, as if my disappearance had been a natural consequence of forces beyond her control. "At first, we just wanted to make things easier for Emma," she said. "But then it became easier for all of us." simpler, cleaner. I realized that my family hadn't just been lying to other people about my existence. They had been lying to themselves, creating a version of reality that was more convenient, more comfortable, more aligned with their aspirations and social ambitions. The Christmas card hadn't been the beginning of my erasure. It had been the moment when my erasure became visible, when the fiction they had been constructing finally took physical form. In the days that followed my conversation with Mother, I began to notice changes in how my family interacted with me. It was as if confronting the deception had somehow made it more real, more powerful. They seemed to have difficulty maintaining normal conversations with me, often appearing startled when I entered a room, as if they had forgotten I would be there. Father began avoiding me entirely, leaving the house when I arrived, scheduling his activities to minimize our contact. When we did encounter each other, he looked at me with an expression of profound discomfort, as if my presence was causing him physical pain. Emma stopped visiting the house when I was there. On the rare occasions when she did come by, she spoke around me rather than to me, addressing all her comments to our parents as if I were invisible. Even Mother, who had at least acknowledged the situation openly, began to treat me with a kind of distracted confusion, as if she couldn't quite remember who I was or why I was in her house. The fiction they had created was consuming the reality, replacing genuine memory and recognition with the simplified narrative they had been telling the outside world. I decided to test the extent of my invisibility by venturing into situations where I should have been recognized. I visited my old high school, attended a community event where I knew I would encounter people who had known me for years. The results were deeply disturbing. Former teachers looked at me with vague confusion, unable to place my face or recall my name. Classmates I had known since elementary school showed no signs of recognition. Even the librarian who had known me since childhood looked through me as if I were a stranger. The erasure wasn't limited to my immediate family or their social circle. It had somehow spread throughout the community, affecting anyone who had ever known me. My existence had been edited out of collective memory with surgical precision. I began to wonder if I was experiencing some kind of psychological break, if the trauma of being excluded from the Christmas card had triggered a complete departure from reality. But the physical evidence was undeniable. I could touch objects, interact with the world, create effects that others could observe even if they couldn't see me as the cause. I existed, but I existed in a space outside recognition, outside memory, outside the shared reality that defined human social existence. Desperate for some explanation for what was happening to me, I began researching phenomena related to memory, recognition, and social invisibility. I spent hours in the public library, reading about psychology, sociology, and even paranormal accounts of people who had somehow slipped out of collective awareness. The closest thing I could find to my experience was a condition called retrospective erasure, where traumatic events could cause communities to collectively forget or deny the existence of certain individuals. But these cases were typically associated with extreme circumstances, war, natural disasters, or other catastrophic events that might trigger mass psychological defense mechanisms. Nothing in my research explained how a simple family decision about a Christmas card photograph could have escalated into complete social invisibility. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Whatever had happened to me was spreading, affecting more people every day, growing stronger rather than weaker as time passed. I began to document everything I could about my condition, taking photographs of myself, recording my voice, writing detailed accounts of my experiences. But even these efforts seemed futile. When I tried to show the photographs to other people, they looked at empty frames. When I played the recordings, they heard only silence. As summer approached, I found myself gradually accepting the reality of my situation. The initial shock and disbelief had given way to a kind of numb resignation. I existed, but I existed alone, outside the social reality that defined human experience for everyone else. My family had achieved exactly what they had wanted. They had created a perfect image of themselves as a harmonious family of three, and that image had become more real than the messy truth of my existence. The Christmas card had been prophetic. It had shown them exactly what their lives would look like without me, and they had chosen to make that vision reality. I continued to live in the house, occupying space that no one else seemed to notice or remember. I ate food that no one missed, used utilities that no one questioned, existed in parallel to a family that had successfully forgotten I had ever been born. The most disturbing aspect of my condition was how natural it had begun to feel. After months of invisibility, I was starting to forget what it felt like to be seen, to be recognized, to matter in someone else's reality. The isolation was becoming normal, expected, almost comfortable. When December arrived for the second time since my erasure, I knew exactly what would happen. The Christmas card photo shoot proceeded exactly as expected, with my family arranging themselves in the same harmonious composition that had worked so well the previous year. But this time, I decided to conduct an experiment. I positioned myself directly in front of the camera during the shoot, standing between the photographer and my family, making myself as visible and present as possible. The photographer continued working as if I weren't there. He adjusted his lighting, directed my family's poses, took dozens of shots without ever acknowledging my presence. Even when I waved my hands directly in front of his lens, he showed no reaction. When the finished cards arrived several weeks later, I examined them carefully for any trace of my interference. The photographs were perfect, showing my family in crisp detail with no shadows, obstructions, or anomalies that might indicate someone had been standing in the way. I had achieved complete invisibility, not just social but physical. I existed in a space that cameras couldn't capture, that eyes couldn't see, that minds couldn't remember. David's parents returned for another visit in January, and this time I made no effort to hide. I sat in the living room during their conversations, walked through the kitchen during their meals, made no attempt to accommodate the fiction of my non-existence. The results were exactly what I had expected. David's parents showed no awareness of my presence whatsoever. I could sit directly beside them on the couch, and they would continue their conversation as if the cushion were empty. I could walk between them and the television, and they would look right through me without interruption. But more disturbing was my family's behavior during this visit. They had become so accustomed to my invisibility that they no longer seemed to require conscious effort to maintain it. Mother served dinner for 4 people but set the table for 3, apparently forgetting that I might need a place. Father discussed family plans that affected me without ever considering my input or presence. Emma, visiting with David for the weekend, spoke about her childhood as if she had been an only child. She told stories about growing up in our house, described family vacations and holiday traditions, painted a picture of the Henderson family history that had no space for me in it. The most chilling moment came when David's mother commented on how Emma must have enjoyed having her parents' complete attention as their only child. Emma agreed warmly, describing the benefits of being the sole focus of her parents' love and aspirations. She spoke with such conviction, such genuine warmth, that I began to wonder if she truly believed what she was saying. Had my family's fiction become so complete that they had genuinely forgotten I existed? Or were they simply so committed to the performance that they could maintain it even in private moments? Driven by a desperate need to preserve some record of my existence, I began creating an extensive archive of documentation. I wrote detailed journals describing my daily experiences, my interactions with my family, my observations of their behavior. I took photographs of my belongings, my room, any physical evidence that might prove I had once been part of this household. But as I worked on this documentation, I began to notice disturbing changes in the physical environment around me. Photographs that had once included me were disappearing from frames and albums. Personal belongings that I remembered owning were no longer in my room. Even my bedroom itself seemed to be changing, becoming smaller, less personalized, as if it were being converted to another purpose. I tried to show my documentation to other people, hoping that written records might somehow break through the invisibility that affected my physical presence. But when I handed my journal to strangers, they looked at blank pages. When I showed them photographs of myself, they saw empty frames. The erasure was retroactive, editing out not just my current existence but all evidence that I had ever existed at all. My family's fiction was rewriting history itself, creating a timeline in which I had never been born. The truth came to me gradually, assembled from fragments of observation and inference over the course of many months. My family hadn't simply decided to exclude me from their public image. They had somehow succeeded in willing me out of existence entirely, using the collective power of their shared belief to edit reality itself. The Christmas card had been the catalyst, the moment when their desire for a perfect family image had crystallized into a force capable of rewriting the fundamental nature of reality. By agreeing to exclude me from that photograph, by collectively choosing to present themselves as a family of 3, they had made that fiction more true than the biological reality of my birth. The process had been gradual but inexorable. Each person who accepted their presentation of themselves as a complete family of 3 added weight to the fiction. Each Christmas card recipient who admired their perfect family portrait contributed to the collective belief that was slowly erasing me from existence. I was disappearing not because of some supernatural curse or psychological condition, but because of the sheer power of collective human belief. When enough people agreed that the Henderson family consisted of 3 members, that agreement became reality. Armed with this understanding, I began trying to resist the erasure by asserting my existence as forcefully as possible. I left notes in places where my family would have to see them. I rearranged furniture, moved objects, created physical disturbances that couldn't be ignored. But my efforts seemed to accelerate the erasure rather than prevent it. The more I tried to prove I existed, the more completely I disappeared from their awareness. It was as if my attempts to break through their fictional reality only strengthened their commitment to maintaining it. I realized that fighting the erasure directly was futile. The collective belief that was eliminating me had momentum, weight, a kind of gravitational pull that grew stronger with each person who accepted my family's version of reality. I was trying to resist a force as powerful as consensus itself. The only way to survive would be to find others who remembered me, who could serve as anchors to prevent my complete disappearance. But everyone who had ever known me seemed to have been affected by the same retroactive editing that was consuming my family's memory. I began searching desperately for anyone who might remember me, traveling to distant cities where I had lived or studied, contacting people through social media and email. But the results were always the same: confusion, lack of recognition, the polite bewilderment of people trying to place a stranger who claimed to know them. Even my college records seemed to have been affected. When I visited my alma mater, the registrar's office had no record of my enrollment. My professors didn't remember teaching me. My diploma, which I had kept carefully preserved in my bedroom, had vanished without explanation. The erasure was comprehensive, systematic, editing out not just my current existence, but every trace of my impact on the world. Jobs I had worked, people I had helped, relationships I had formed, all had been retroactively nullified, leaving no evidence that I had ever participated in human society. I began to understand that my family's fiction wasn't just affecting their own memory and the memory of people they knew directly. It was somehow propagating outward, creating ripples that reached every corner of my past, every person I had ever encountered, every institution that had ever acknowledged my existence. As the third Christmas since my erasure approached, I knew it would be my last opportunity to exist even as an observer of my family's life. The process consuming me was accelerating, and I could feel my grip on physical reality weakening with each passing day. I positioned myself in the living room during the photo shoot, not to interfere but simply to witness the culmination of what had begun with my exclusion from that first Christmas card. The photographer worked with practiced efficiency, capturing image after image of my family's perfect harmony. But this year, something was different. As I watched my family pose for their portraits, I noticed that they seemed somehow incomplete, as if they were unconsciously aware that something was missing from their composition. Mother's smile appeared forced. Father's posture seemed uncertain. Even Emma, the architect of my exclusion, looked vaguely uncomfortable. They had achieved exactly what they had wanted, a perfect family image with no complications, no inconvenient truths, no elements that might detract from their carefully curated presentation. But the cost of that perfection was becoming visible in subtle ways, a hollowness that no amount of professional photography could completely disguise. On Christmas morning, as my family exchanged gifts and shared their traditional breakfast, I found myself standing in front of the hallway mirror, studying my reflection. I could still see myself clearly, could observe every detail of my appearance, could confirm that I continued to exist in some form. But as I watched, my reflection began to change in ways that defied physical law. I appeared to be fading, becoming translucent, as if the mirror were showing not my current state but my future condition. The erasure that had consumed my social existence was finally reaching my physical being. I understood then that I had very little time left. The collective belief that had edited me out of everyone else's reality was finally strong enough to edit me out of reality itself. Soon, even I would forget that I had ever existed. The irony was profound. My family had succeeded in creating their perfect image, but that success was costing them more than they could have imagined. They were losing not just me, but the richness and complexity that came with acknowledging difficult truths, accepting imperfection, embracing the full reality of human family life. In my final days of existence, I began to understand something that my family never would. The Christmas card that had started this entire process wasn't actually perfect. Without me, their family portrait lacked something essential, the authenticity that comes from including everyone, the completeness that comes from accepting rather than editing reality. Their carefully curated image was beautiful but hollow, harmonious but incomplete. They had gained the approval of people like David's parents, had achieved the social acceptance they had desired, but they had lost something infinitely more valuable in the process. I could see the cost of their success in small moments, mother's distracted sadness during quiet evenings, father's growing isolation from emotional connection, Emma's increasing dependence on external validation to feel complete. They had edited out not just me, but the part of themselves that was capable of unconditional acceptance. The collective belief that was erasing me was also erasing their capacity for the kind of love that doesn't require perfection, that doesn't demand conformity to external expectations. They were becoming as hollow as the fiction they had created. As my physical form continued to fade, I found myself able to move through walls, to exist in spaces that should have been solid, to observe my family from vantage points that should have been impossible. I was becoming something between memory and ghost, present but not present, real but not real. I used this final phase of my existence to watch my family with complete invisibility, to observe them in moments when they believed themselves to be entirely alone. What I saw confirmed my understanding of what they had lost. Mother would sometimes pause in her daily activities, looking around the house with an expression of profound confusion, as if she knew something was missing but couldn't identify what it might be. She would count the bedrooms, check the place settings at dinner, seem momentarily surprised that everything added up to 3 when some part of her expected 4. Father had developed a habit of looking toward my bedroom door when he passed it in the hallway, his expression troubled by something he couldn't name. Sometimes he would stand there for several minutes, clearly disturbed by a feeling he couldn't understand or articulate. Even Emma, during her visits, would occasionally glance around the living room with a frown of concentration, as if trying to remember something just beyond the edge of consciousness. The most heartbreaking moment came 3 days before I finally disappeared completely. Mother was organizing old photograph albums, preparing to digitize family memories, when she came across a picture from my 10th birthday party. For just a moment, her expression changed to one of recognition, of genuine memory, as if the collective fiction had briefly weakened enough for truth to break through. She stared at the photograph for several minutes, and I could see her struggling with competing versions of reality. In that image, she could see herself with 2 children, could see the genuine happiness on all our faces, could remember a time when her family's completeness didn't depend on exclusion or deception. But the moment passed. She closed the album without removing the photograph, without acknowledging what she had seen. The fiction reasserted itself, stronger than ever, and she returned to her digitization project with renewed focus on the curated version of our family history. That was the last time anyone would remember me, even briefly. The collective belief in my non-existence had become too powerful for even biological memory to overcome. I write this final account from a place that exists outside time, outside reality as it is understood by those who remain in the world of shared consensus. I am not dead, exactly, but I am no longer alive in any way that matters. I exist as possibility, as the ghost of a choice not made, as the shadow cast by a perfect family portrait. The Christmas card that began my erasure continues to circulate, passed from hand to hand, shared on social media, reproduced in holiday newsletters. Each viewing strengthens the fiction of my family's perfect completeness, adds weight to the collective belief that they have always been exactly what they appear to be. My family has achieved everything they wanted. They are socially successful, widely admired, held up as an example of what a modern family should look like. David's parents dote on them. Emma's marriage thrives in the glow of her family's perfect image. Mother and father have become pillars of their community. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I see them pause and look around as if listening for something they can't quite hear, searching for something they can't quite name. They have gained the world's approval, but they have lost the ability to love unconditionally, to accept imperfection, to value truth over image. The Christmas card sits on mantles across the country, a testament to the power of collective belief to reshape reality itself. But it also serves as a warning about the cost of pursuing perfection, about what happens when we choose image over authenticity, when we edit out the complicated truths that make us fully human. I existed. I was part of a family that chose to make me disappear rather than accept the challenge of loving me as I was. In seeking to create the perfect Christmas card, they lost something far more valuable than any photograph could ever capture. And somewhere, in a box that no one remembers storing, sits a manila envelope containing proof that families are most beautiful not when they conform to the expectations, but when they have the courage to include everyone, to embrace complexity, to choose love over image. The envelope waits, patient and forgotten, holding photographs of what we were before we chose to become what others wanted to see. In those images, we are imperfect but complete, complicated but authentic, real in ways that no amount of careful curation could ever replicate. But no one will look for those photographs now. The fiction has become too complete, too powerful, too necessary for my family's sense of themselves. They will continue to exist in their carefully crafted reality, perfect and hollow, harmonious and incomplete. And I will exist here, in the space between memory and forgetting, between truth and fiction, between what was and what might have been. I am the family member who wasn't allowed in the photo, the inconvenient truth that was edited out of the perfect image. I am the reminder that some things, once lost, can never be recovered. The Christmas cards will continue to arrive each December, each one a small act of collective forgetting, each one a choice to value appearance over authenticity. And with each card, the fiction grows stronger, the erasure more complete, the distance between image and truth more impossible to bridge. This is my testimony, written from beyond the reach of collective belief, preserved in the space where erased things go to wait for someone who might remember that they once existed. I was real. I was here. I was part of a family that chose perfection over truth, image over love, the approval of strangers over the acceptance of their own child. And in making that choice, they lost more than they could ever understand. The Christmas card was perfect, but the cost of that perfection was everything that mattered.